Welcome back, everybody, to What Really Matters. I'm Jeremy Stern with you in Los Angeles. I'm here, as always, with Walter Russell Mead of Tablet, the Wall Street Journal, Hudson Institute, and the Hamilton Center at the University of Florida. Let's start with this week's news. First story of the week, and at times it seemed like the only story this week. The Trump administration added Atlantic editor Jeffrey Goldberg to a private Signal group chat of senior government officials, then texted him detailed non-public information about forthcoming airstrikes on the Houthis. The group chat included National Security Advisor Michael Waltz, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Vice President J.D. Vance, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, the directors of national intelligence in the CIA, the White House Chief of Staff, and others. Waltz informed them that he was establishing a group to discuss military options on Houthi targets. A policy discussion followed, and to make a long story short, on Saturday morning, March 15th, Hegseth sent a message to the chat outlining timings of the attacks, the weapons the U.S. would be deploying, and attack sequencing. The strikes took place a few hours later. Walter, was this news or faux news?
Oh, I think it's news. Hard to know what kind of news it is. It's best news for Jeffrey Goldberg in a long time. And I would like to suggest that whoever is the minister of leaks in the Trump administration, that they really need to add me to those chats. I could bring a lot of insight into those chats. The original story is sort of mind-blowing. It is something that happens in early in an administration. You know, people are talking about unprecedented and so on. Well, it's unprecedented, but only in the sense that, you know, it's only been like 10 years that we've had stuff like Signal, 10 or 15 years. It's not like, oh, yes, I can remember when Abe Lincoln, Secretary of the Treasury, texted, a Confederate, although we do know, what was it, Robert E. Lee left the battle plans or one of his generals for Antietam wrapped in around cigars. So, leaks do happen. They happen in different ways based on technological situation. So I think there's a little bit of overload of reaction just because the tech stuff is new. There's also this factor of a new administration where people just make stupid amateur hour mistakes. Even people who've been in these senior roles before weren't necessarily in this role with this group of colleagues. And so things slip between the cracks, coordination goes awry. And within the Trump administration, you've got a large number of people who are really doing things not only they have never done before, but never thought they would be doing. So it's not at all surprising. This is probably not going to be the last failure of this kind. I don't think it's the end of the world. I don't think it's a great moment in America, and people will not look back on this as one of the great moments of the Trump administration, but neither will anybody look at this as the moment when the wheels fell off and things stopped working.
Beyond the sloppiness of, adding a major magazine editor to the cabinet group chat, the screenshots Goldberg published, especially later, were kind of interesting in terms of the actual policy discussion they revealed. Vance, in particular, said he thought the operation was a mistake. I think he said something like, I just hate bailing out Europe again. And Tulsi Gabbard appeared to agree before the White House Deputy Chief of Staff appeared to end the discussion by reminding them all that Trump had already made a decision. Did Vance's private remarks tell us anything useful here, or it's about what you would have expected?
If anybody thought that J.D. Vance had entered had entered the Trump administration in order to advance the cause of the European Union, then that person has been living on a very different planet from me. No, and remember that back in the Obama years, Victoria Nuland was the Russians rather maliciously passed off something that they had heard from her, where her language about Europe was even stronger than Vance's. So, for Europeans, I think this is an important sign that the Trump people aren't just faking it; they actually mean it. And Europe does need to stop freeloading on the United States and needs to think about what it would mean to take responsibility for European security in a dangerous world.
All right, our second story. Thousands of Palestinians marched between the wreckage of a heavily destroyed town in northern Gaza for multiple days of anti-war protest this week, with many chanting against Hamas in a rare display of public anger against the militant group. The protests, which centered mainly on Gaza's north, according to the Associated Press, appeared to be aimed generally against the war, with protesters calling for an end to 17 months of deadly fighting with Israel. But protesters also leveled unusually direct and public criticism of Hamas, which has squashed dissent in Gaza violently in the past. Walter, is this news or faux news?
News, but not as big news as some people would hope here. It does mean one thing that it clearly means is that Hamas is not as powerful in the north of Gaza as it still is in the south. And we've seen a few demonstrations in the south, but basically Hamas's power center, what's left of it, is I think mostly in the south. In the north, its hold is weakened. I've seen some stories that the Palestinian Authority was backing these protests, and that sort of the backbone of the protests were people associated with the Palestinian Authority. If so, that's interesting that the PA is trying to reassert itself on the ground in Gaza. You know, they were originally in charge of Gaza early on, but Hamas kicked them out violently. And so the sign that they're trying to kind of get back in. But this is certainly not a sign that the population of Gaza is seeking permanent peace with Israel, that they're ready to work toward the two-state solution. You know, we should not sort of we shouldn't overinterpret it. But it's very clear that the policies Hamas has been following are, they're willing to fight Israel to the last civilian in Gaza. And they don't care how much blood of Gazan children, Gazan old people, Gazan civilians is shed in this war, as long as it feeds their sort of ideological fervor, their narcissism, frankly, they're willing to go for it, and also maybe keeps them alive a little bit longer. I'm not sure that they are all as eager to meet Allah as their theology would tell you they should be. So, it is a sign that breaking the political power of Hamas is closer at hand than some have thought. So many people will tell you, oh, Hamas is an idea. You can't beat an idea. At the end of the war, Hamas will be running Gaza. That's possible. You can't rule it out. But this does suggest that if what you're trying to do is to get the transition to a post-Hamas Gaza, actually this Israeli pressure, vilified by everyone around the world, and let's make no bones about it, achieved at a terrible cost of civilian death and suffering, that it is succeeding to some degree in its goals.
All right, final story of the week. Vice President J.D. Vance and other top U.S. officials have arrived in Greenland, where residents have expressed deep unease about the visit after President Trump vowed to acquire the island, quote, one way or the other. After an uproar from Greenland officials and the Danish prime minister, the trip was scaled back to a stop at a remote U.S. military base in the far north, with no scheduled stops in the capital or other parts of the island. President Trump has said the United States has a security imperative to acquire the world's largest island, declining in the past to rule out military force. And just before we started recording, Walter, Trump said to press from the Oval Office, quote, "We need Greenland, very important for our international security. We have to have Greenland. It's not a question of, do you think we can do without it? We can't," close quote. Walter, news or faux news?
It walks the line, because in one way, you could have, if you gave me that quotation from President Trump and simply put underneath it Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1941, okay? Roosevelt felt exactly the same way. And at the time, Denmark was occupied by Nazi Germany, and the United States had absolutely no intention of allowing Danish quisling authorities to have anything to do with the governance of Greenland. So the idea that Greenland is vital for American national security, I would say, is an old and bipartisan concept. And what obviously is a little new is the unorthodoxy of method by which Donald Trump appears bent on managing this longstanding issue in American security. Now, if I parse his language very carefully, it doesn't actually seem to me that anything he's said yet actually requires that the flag of the United States fly over every postal station in Greenland. And I think the postmasters of Greenland should be very happy about that because Doge would likely come in and they might not like what happened to their postal service jobs. The key issue here, I do think, remains that the movement toward independence among people in Greenland, independence from Denmark, is a real factor. And the United States really would have a problem on its hands if Greenland, whatever, 60, 70,000 people became independent. And then, Russia's involved in the mix and China's involved in the mix. And so you have this kind of bidding for influence. This is not a situation the United States would want to find itself facing. So I think it does seem to me pretty clear that every legitimate security interest that the United States has in Greenland could be met through negotiations, both with the Danish government and with locally elected officials. That there's really Greenland is a very large place. It's not as big as it looks on the Mercator projections. It's not actually like bigger than Texas, but it's a big place, and you could put a lot of American military bases in Greenland in ways that nobody living in Greenland would have any, would know about, would it wouldn't bother them, not even like loud noises of planes landing. So in that sense, what America actually needs in Greenland is compatible with the interests of the other parties involved. And in fact, from the Danish point of view, every new American soldier, every new American base, every new American facility in Greenland enhances Danish security because it means less chance that Russia would ever be able to do anything coming down through the sea there, and paradoxically strengthens NATO and strengthens America's commitment to NATO and its ability to fulfill its responsibilities in NATO. It's good for Norway. It's good for Sweden, good for Finland. So what's interesting here is that they've taken something that could be a very consensual issue as part of a generalized Nordic NATO buildup, which would be quite welcome. The Nordic countries are raring to go. They're worried about Russia. They want to strengthen NATO, and a stronger American presence in Greenland absolutely would be great. But the way the Trump administration is going about this is creating obstacles for the policy and adding to the cost of the policy. Now, I think, I understand that my old friend Andrew Jackson has been joined on the walls of the Oval Office by his chosen successor, James K. Polk. And there is a sense that, Trump would like to add territory to the United States just for the sake of, just to make our country bigger. I'm not opposed to American expansion. I once wrote an article that was admittedly a little tongue-in-cheek about how the United States should buy Siberia from Russia for $3 trillion.
Was it for sale?
Well, I actually went out there. GQ magazine sent me out there to ask, and what I heard was sale was impossible, but 99-year lease could work. So, real missed opportunity. George H.W. Bush could have been up there on Mount Rushmore. So, Trump may have heard that same siren call. It is also possible that in some way in Trump's mind, Ukraine and Greenland are kind of linked. If Russia gets Ukraine, America gets Greenland. That's the sort of attitude I think Putin would enjoy having Trump embrace. Because in fact, if Trump signs agreements with Denmark that allow an increase of American, military positioning in Greenland, that makes NATO stronger. It's actually bad for Russia. But if Trump essentially takes Greenland from Denmark without Denmark's consent, it sort of destroys NATO. when one member of an alliance literally annexes territory claimed by another, that kind of takes any possible meaning out of an alliance. So if Putin could somehow get Trump to take Greenland as opposed to negotiating for it, it would be a huge victory for Russia, especially if that led Trump to be, more accepting of Putin's claims in Ukraine as the price. Putin would sell him something that Putin doesn't own for a price that Trump wouldn't have to pay. This would go over really well in the Kremlin. But it's I think it's early to tell just how far the administration is going to press this stuff. I do worry.
All right, that does it for this week's news. Let's have the big conversation. You wrote this week, Walter, that with so much going on, it's more vital than ever to distinguish between the deep trends bringing lasting change to the Middle East and the dramatic but ultimately less important events that often dominate the headlines. Among the major developments, you wrote, we can count the strategic defeat of Iran's axis of resistance, Russia's loss of influence following the fall of Bashar al-Assad, Turkey's increasing engagement in Middle East politics, and the continuing decline of Egypt as a regional force. You also noted that power in the region has passed to Persian Gulf states such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict appears to be entering a new stage, and the Iranian nuclear program is, if anything, becoming a greater danger. So from the standpoint of American interests, it seems like there's some good news here and some bad. Can you kind of scan this landscape for us and tell us what are or should be the key American interests at stake in all this turmoil? Not that all Americans or even Trump's cabinet are fully aligned on what those are.
All right. Well, I think our interests in the Middle East are actually fairly constant. We'd like it to pump oil and gas to the rest of the world and sell it at a reasonable price. China would like a lower price on oil than we do. We actually produce a lot of oil and gas ourselves. So we want a compromise price between the sort of extortionate OPEC price hawk, Russia price hawk concept, and then what the oil price doves want to see. So the status quo kind of works for us on pricing, but we don't want that to change. We also don't want any other country to gain the ability to interrupt the flow of oil and gas from the Middle East to other countries. Now, if you're thinking like J.D. Vance was on the Red Sea business, like why should we worry about opening the Red Sea when it's more important for Europe's trade than our trade? You might say, well, we don't actually buy any oil from the Middle East, so why do we care that whether or not they sell it? And the answer would be that not just the Europeans, but the Japanese, the Indians, many other countries do depend on that oil. And if that flow were interrupted, we would ourselves face huge economic problems. Now, partly because their trade would be down, and maybe the Trump administration would say, excellent, we'll be the only ones with oil and we'll be making all the stuff. But I think if you looked at the stock market and the financial sector, how a massive depression in Japan would affect the U.S. household, consumer, and business, it would be pretty bad. So from our point of view, keeping that oil flowing is important. It also means, as the security guarantor of the Middle East, there are things that we get. One of them is that when the Arabs decide, okay, we need to buy some more arms, our weapons companies tend to have the inside track. Now, these, as arms buyers, there's a very short list of countries that can afford top-of-the-line kit. And furthermore, an even shorter list of countries that you're pretty confident aren't going to use that kit against you and your friends. And the Gulf Arab states in particular, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, have a lot of money and are willing to buy arms, have bought a lot of arms from the U.S. side. This doesn't just help our arms companies, it reduces the unit cost to Americans of everything that our arms industry makes. Because let's say we were only making F-35s for ourselves and no one else was buying them. The cost per plane would be like twice what it is now. And it's pretty high now. It's like 80 to $100 million plus maintenance. So having a larger customer base actually makes it cheaper for us to maintain our defenses. So that's important. And then you have the question of what the Arabs do with all of this money that they have in their sovereign wealth funds or just generally sloshing around. And do you want that money to go to Chinese tech startups and Chinese AI companies, or would you like it to come to Silicon Valley and help our folks do things? Again, I think from an American point of view, there's not much doubt that this is important. And if the Arabs are on kind of our side, people talk about the I2U2 tech corridor, India, Israel, USA, UAE, but throw in the Saudis as well. What you have is a massive investment markets capability that will be where the rules are going to be written as the United States would like these rules to be written, not the way that China would like the rules to go. So we have a lot of connections to the Middle East that make a lot of sense, that are serious national interests. And this, by the way, is why every American president since World War II, from Harry Truman to Donald Trump, has ended up having to do more in the Middle East than they came into office wanting to do. No American president sort of comes in and takes the oath of office and says, oh, at last, now I can get really involved in the Middle East. And, I can send troops and have wars and, it's going to be so much fun. That's not how they think. But the fact is that the Middle East matters to us in so many different dimensions that we can't be indifferent. So the question is, how do you get the most of the things that we want while taking on the lowest costs and lowest risks? That's really the question for us in the Middle East.
Just one follow-up. So given all those dynamics, Israel's military successes against Iranian proxies, the loss of some Russian and Iranian power in the region, the ascendance of, Turkish kind of diplomacy and military operations in the region, which, despite other problems, Turkey is still a treaty ally of the United States. Do you think this is a time for the United States to kind of try to press its advantages in the Middle East and try to, weaken Russian and Iranian hold over the region? Or are we still in a position where we kind of are forced to react to events?
We always are forced to react to events because really what we would like to do about the Middle East is nothing at all. All right. In an American utopia, we would rarely think about the Middle East, and even more rarely would we act in it. Israel wouldn't be under threat, and we wouldn't have to do anything about it. The oil would be flowing, and we wouldn't have to do anything. That's what we want. And so, in general, what happens is something happens in the Middle East that we don't want, or that threatens to produce consequences that we don't want, and then we get involved. Now, I think we made a bit of mistake sort of at the height of, the post 9/11 era of thinking that our interests would never be safe unless the whole Middle East was democratic. And so we added not just promoting, but ginning up democracy in a bunch of Middle East countries. And I think that was more than we can usefully accomplish. And if democracy comes to the Middle East, it won't be us who brings it in. I hope it comes, and if it comes, I hope we have good relations with democratic governments. But this is a place where I think the restrainers have a case against the neoconservatives. It's in our interest to focus narrowly on a smaller set of interests, more easily achievable set of interests in the Middle East, and comprehensible both to the American people and to people in the region. Not that we fight democracy or help rulers crush democracy, but that we kind of leave that to the historic and cultural processes of these different countries. But, what'll happen is some country like Iran will mount a bid to control the Middle East. Now, as long as it's not too much of a bid, we don't have to do much about it because, hey, if it's not happening, we can't waste our time and energy like trying to micromanage. Well, if this happens, this might happen, this might happen, this might happen, this might happen, and then it would be bad. We need to be more focused. But Iran had gone way past any kind, it had taken over Iraq, it had taken over Syria, it had taken over Lebanon, it was taking over Yemen, it was sort of causing problems everywhere it went. And that was something that did concern us. Fortunately for the United States, Israel, with some arms from the Biden administration, managed to deal with a lot of that far more effectively. So now we're sort of down to the final question of the nuclear weapons. And there is a chance that Iran might now actually do something it hasn't done so far, which is to negotiate seriously and from a position of weakness, of acknowledged weakness. And we might actually be able to get a binding agreement, an enforceable and verifiable agreement on nuclear weapons that could work. But they may not choose to go that route, and then we'd have to do something else, or at least try to help other people do something else.
All right, that does it for the big conversation. Let's end on the tip of the week. Another listener request this week, Walter. This one from George in New Orleans, who wants to know your favorite Southern writer.
Oh, that's hard. Favorite. Wow. When I think about it, I suppose you really have to say Faulkner, which so many people are now rolling their eyes and saying, what a cliche. But honestly, his sort of Faulkner's imagination, his intellectual grasp of Southern history, his ability to look beyond stereotypes of all kinds. To me, Light in August remains one of the greatest, if not the greatest, American novel in many ways. It's an extraordinary look at the dynamics of a small town, at the dynamics of the South, at racial dynamics in the United States. And you realize it was written at a time when the ideas that are in there were not particularly fashionable in the world that Faulkner inhabited. He was some people, he must be about as untranslatable as an American author can be. But if you can read Southern, if you can understand Southern, then there are few experiences, I think, that go with him. But I can't let this pass without honorable mention to Flannery O'Connor, who again is absolutely amazing as a stylist, as a thinker, as a really sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued observer of American realities. I can't leave Walker Percy out. Ignatius O'Reilly and Confederacy of Dunces. What an extraordinary, I guess that's Peter O'Toole was the writer. Absolutely amazing stuff. The one thing I can say as a Southerner about Southern literature is that you often hear this, people categorize a lot of Southern literature as Southern Gothic. And I have to say, as somebody who's spent a lot of time in the South, I was born there, there's no such thing as Southern Gothic. That is Southern realism, John. That is the way things are. And it is the writers who've been able to present it have done an amazing job.
All right, there you have it. Thanks to our producer, Noam Bloom. Thanks to Will Cummings at Hudson and my co-host, Walter Russell Mead. I'm Jeremy Stern. We'll see you next week. And until then, please go rate and review us. This helps other people find the show.